I'm dwfearn, and this is my take on music recording. My guest today is Chuck Anderson, who you may remember from a two-part episode from 2021, where we had a wide-ranging discussion on many musical topics. The links to those episodes are in the description. Chuck is a jazz guitarist, composer, and studio musician who has played with many prominent people during his long career. He is also a lifelong teacher and lecturer. Today, we talk about how the various musical genres evolved and interconnected to form pop music over the past 100 years. But first, Chuck explains where music came from in the first place. I'd be interested in hearing where you start with this explanation of it.
I think I'll go right back to prehistoric, right back to the caveman for starters. The term contemporary music, as we know, means something different to everybody according to what era they're in. Contemporary in 1930 is not contemporary music this year or any other year. So I think in order to see evolution, we have to see the path that music has taken from the very beginning. Now, if we do too much detail on it, I think this is a 15-hour podcast. And so since I assume that's a little long, I'll kind of dash through history quite quickly to get up to the more current times. But I think a good place to start is to say, where did music start in general? There are people that think music started with rock and roll, and those that thought music started with classical music. But the reality is the essence of music did start in the prehistoric times. And the first instrument, so to speak, the first element of music was rhythm. And rhythm was a beat created by the hands or beating on logs or something else like that. So if we think of what makes music, what are the three elements of music? We know that it's rhythm, harmony, and melody. Not necessarily in that order, but in this particular case, rhythm was first. The next thing that happened is prehistoric man attempted to simulate birdsong. And that attempt to simulate birdsong is what actually led to melody. Now, for years and years and years and years and centuries, that's all music had. It had melody and it had rhythm. The complex thing that happened ultimately that brings music to what we recognize as music today is harmony. That is, chords that accompany that. And it may be interesting to note that still today in cultures such as India, there is no harmony, there is no chords. All there is a melody and a rhythm. And the surprising thing of that is that, you can't go get your guitar and play authentic Indian music by strumming a G chord, a C chord, and a D chord, because they had a drone that, that sound, and then melody on top of that, and very complicated rhythm under that. It's also interesting to note that the Indian culture has up to 58, I think it's 58, 54, something like that, notes in its system. We have 12. They have far more. It's like if you can imagine a piano and you put 12 keys between a white and a black, that's where all the notes would be. So we're grateful that didn't happen in the Western culture. But the Western culture brought harmony in. And of course, obviously, there's the entire history of classical music in Europe. We're not going to deal with that because we're not going to really define that as contemporary music. The term itself is somewhat difficult because it certainly means a time frame, as in music that occurs now. But it's also a difference between contemporary and traditional, contemporary and classical. And so we're going to look at the classical music form more as an art form, then we're going to look at it as a commercial form, and therefore we won't touch anything in classical. That could be a topic in and of itself, certainly, since classical music had its own evolutions wherever you start, whether you start with the Bach and Beethoven, et cetera, and move all the way to Stravinsky and Copland and, everybody else. But that's not going to be part of what we're talking about. We're talking about more the music that most people have been exposed to. So that's where we'll start. So we're out of the caves already, and we got chords going on. So I think for this country in particular, the best place to start is probably the blues itself. The blues is an American form, and it was somewhat formalized in maybe 1920, early 1900s, something like that. There will always be debate on years. So we're not trying to do a scientific survey of this happened on such and such a date. But just in general, 1920, certainly the blues came about. What is significant about the blues is that it is a constant thread in contemporary music from the time it first appeared on the scene till today. And it's part of every American subdivision of music. Jazz is perceived as American. Rock and roll was American. Country music was American. Every one of those have elements of blues. Even the most avant-garde jazz, even if you do Thelonious Monk or whoever you want to do, you'll still see blues all over that. Now, blues itself was created, as we think of it today anyway, through the African culture, the slave culture in particular, who did a lot of singing at night on the plantations. And one of the strange things that they came up with was they were singing notes that those who had European musical training couldn't figure out what notes they were singing. We know them today as bent notes, but that didn't exist in classical music at all. So therefore, what began to happen is they started to call those notes blue notes. And that basically meant notes that were out of tune. But eventually we realized that that was a legitimate stylistic part of blues. What was sung at the time was work songs, protest songs, songs of longing, songs of love, etc. And of course, where all of this started to merge was that the other cultures that came into this country, whether they be Irish, English, or Welsh, had their own material, the folk songs of Ireland and England and Wales. And so they were the ones, which was more of a white component, they were the ones that kind of merged with the black and culture. And it was one of the earliest and really most successful times that these two cultures had merged, And so because of that, then we saw some interesting things happening. And that is that because the music of Ireland, England, and Wales was premised on the so-called major pentatonic scale, but the black music, the African-based music, was based on a minor pentatonic. So because of those two things, interestingly enough, the major pentatonic influence is what made country music. And that was the southern side, the Nashville side. In fact, sometimes we call today that major pentatonic scale, we call it the southern pentatonic. We call it the Nashville pentatonic. And that's the sound that if you're gonna sound southern and country, that's the scale you better be in. On the other hand, if you're maybe more towards a B.B. King type of blues, then the other one is common as well. But eventually they all merged together so that blues kind of took on a bright quality through the major pentatonics influenced by Europeans, and then a darker quality influenced by particularly the African slaves on plantations. And those two elements merging became critical in the evolution and development of all the contemporary forms of music. So I think that that's an important thing to start out and to be aware of. So this blues music not only became a thing itself, it also became an element that was wound into all these other American forms. It certainly went hard into New Orleans, where we see Dixieland music and all of those things. Blues is all over New Orleans music. And then from there, we went and we started to split off from where blues started. And so if the blues went, let's say, south, it became country music. If it went west, it became Western swing music. When it went to Chicago or New York, either in Chicago or New York, it became jazz. And then when it went down towards Memphis, it became rock and roll. And then rock and roll became something else. And that's where this whole evolution thing comes, is to see how one form morphs, into another form. And so once we get past the 20s, and a lot of traditional blues occurred in the 20s, the Nashville or the New Orleans stuff was very strong then. And then we moved into the 30s and 40s. 30s and 40s was the era of the big bands, whether you're talking about Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, whoever it happened to be. And what most people, maybe younger people today, don't realize is that was contemporary music. That was pop music. The term pop is really just an abbreviation of popular, or music for the populace. It was not intended to be music for the highly musically educated, conservatory-trained musicians. That's not what pop was. Pop was for normal people. And what was music going to be used for? It was going to be used for what it was always used for. It was for love songs, breakup songs. It was for, any human emotion that you can imagine. That was the purpose of music. When Dylan came along later on, one of the things that was unique about Dylan was the fact that he was one of the first people that started to create music that wasn't boy gets girl, boy loses girl. Suddenly there were much bigger topics, psychology, suicide, anything like that was certainly more advanced, But before we get to Dylan, of course, and we go through the big band era, and as most people would know, they were bands of either 12 to 16 or 17 musicians, traveled all over all the time. They lived in buses. They were on the road constantly. So the 30s sailed along okay, but then when we got to the 40s, we had a little problem called World War II. And World War II required so many people to be drafted that was really the death of the big bands. It wasn't that people lost interest in it. I mean, big bands is what you'd have at your prom. Big bands is what you'd have at your wedding. Seems different than now, but it was the popular music of the day. But at that point, the bands lost so many members because of being drafted into the Army. And then they were gone for 4 years or however many years they were gone. And so that was really the death knell of the big bands. I don't think it was a lack of interest, although sooner or later it may have been hard to pay for the big bands because there are too many people there. But they were just in buses, living in buses, sleeping on buses, and going all over the place. But they were the stars of the day. And those band leaders, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, they were legitimate celebrities, like girl screaming celebrities, at that time. So as it died down because of the lack of members, then we had a big problem, and there was that kind of period where the smaller groups were playing because they couldn't get that many people, for the bigger bands. And when the musicians came back from the war, of course, they certainly missed playing, and they wanted to play, but two things they didn't want to do. They didn't want to get on the bus and travel again. They'd been away from their families for, 4 years or so. So what they decided that they wanted to do is get together in little groups, combos. That was kind of the beginning of combo jazz. And where did they play? Well, they'd usually have a buddy who owned a bar, and the bar would close at 2 o'clock, and the musicians asked if they could get together and, as they say, jam after it was closed. So that was great. And the only problem was people started to find out that music was going on. So people started going back to the bar at 2 o'clock. And the musicians were not overly happy that the public was coming because it was intended to be their time. And because of that, I think it's one of the places where jazz developed a reputation for being audience unfriendly. I think they originally, they didn't want an audience. They weren't there to have an audience, And of course, this is the period then where they began to play tunes that they knew from the big band era, but they were no longer going to have charts. They were no longer going to have the sax parts and the trumpet parts. And that's what led to the so-called lead sheet. And the lead sheet was just music that had the title of the tune, the melody, and the chord changes. And people just used it and jammed it. And of course, eventually that turned into the so-called fake books, which I know people have asked me over the years many times, what does the word fake book mean? It doesn't mean what it sounds like. Right. What fake book actually meant was fake meant to improvise your part from a lead sheet. So you might say to a musician, do you fake? Which sounds like a terrible question. But the answer in most cases was either yes or no, because if they were a normally trained musician, they didn't improvise and they could read. That's why they were great for the big bands. So the fake books then became an illegal collection of lead sheets that everybody used to decide what they were going to play. And of course, throughout the years, the humor in the industry became that they started to call them the real book. And the real book was just a pun on fake book. And they were originally started by students from Berkeley College who just started putting them together and started to illegally sell them because of the fact that they didn't have the publisher's name on them, and therefore the royalties and the publishing rights. I remember when I had a school back in the 80s that a guy drove in from Chicago with a station wagon, had boxes of those books, which all my students bought because they were a great thing, And it was one of those things where you'd go into a store and they wouldn't quite be for sale, but you'd always say, Joe sent me, and then you could get those. And even today, musicians use those, all the time.
Yeah, there's, I came across one here not too long ago when I was going through this big pile of music.
Yes. Everybody had them, and it didn't even, I don't even know if it ever was determined to be that illegal because of the fact that so much of it was used for education, but it was, it was an interesting period then. So during this period where the people were coming to the jams is when we began to develop bebop. And bebop was a form of jazz. Now, bebop was characterized by virtuosic playing, great speed, and whatnot. And sooner or later, it became somewhat like the fastest gun in town. And I always felt that bebop lost its audience for two reasons. One, it had no regard for its audience, one. And two, they played so fast people didn't even know what they were doing. They couldn't dance to it, so that was out because they had done that with the big bands, right? So now it had gotten to the point that it was just virtuosic playing, and there was a sense that the musicians were playing for each other and not for the public, which is actually true. So I think that was the thing that caused problems with bebop. And it was such a short period. Of course, founders of bebop were Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. And that music, had a short-lived popularity, contemporary music, but because of the things I mentioned, it didn't have a long-lasting influence. But today, jazz musicians still study that, but it's not quite the same, as the bebop era itself. So that was in the late 40s. The big bands were gone. And so now music, as one of my basic tenets in this evolution, is musicians tend to advance the music, more complex, faster, deeper, whatever it is. And the public, the contemporary public, would only handle so much of that. And then when it got to a certain point, they rebelled. And then music had to go in another direction. And so that's the great thing that we had. Well, depends great. That's the thing that did happen between the end of bebop and the 50s. So in the 50s, we had rockabilly, which was a combination of what was to become rock and also hillbilly music, Southern music. And that led directly to rock and roll. And that's where we bring in Elvis and Fats Domino, all the people that became, Bill Haley in the Comets, became known in rock and roll. Now that was one of the strongest contemporary forms in terms of evolution. Now it got to the point that they could just have millions of listeners and followers. Part of that was because the music was intended to let them dance, and that's what they wanted to do. And the other one is it dealt with teenage angst and all. And of course, that led to the American Bandstand show, which Dick Clark had in Philadelphia for many years. And the thing that was always classic of that, they'd play a new record and then ask the kids what they thought of it. And it was always, give it a 90. It's got a good beat. I like to dance. And so there was really no sense of this was a well-written song or a well-crafted song, but that was one of the most blatant searches for an audience, is to play music at the level that the average person could relate to and dance to and play at parties and things like that. So at that time, of course, that was huge, and that led to all kinds of chaos, with people wanting to ban rock and roll and all that, and Elvis Presley and Ed Sullivan Show. A funny story of that era, I think it was 1957, Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, much like the Beatles did later. And everybody was quite enthused. My older sister was a huge fan of Elvis, and my mother was a huge fan of Elvis. My father, not so much. He was a fan of the big bands, and he already thought you're going to hell in a handbasket anyway. But I will never forget that we were in the living room watching the Ed Sullivan Show, and they had Elvis on, and at the end, Sullivan came on and said, "For the first time in the history of our show, we're going to have this young man back next week." They'd never had somebody back 2 weeks in a row. My sister let out a blood-curdling scream. And my father, who was asleep on the couch, woke up and go, what? Thought somebody got killed. And he actually fell off the couch. So we knew that rock and roll was here to stay, So at that time, That was contemporary music, rock and roll. Included, of course, at that time, the doo-wop groups that were singing as well. And that whole period, was really the period of the 50s. And of course, pretty soon, everything's going to start to overlap. Things didn't overlap that much between big band, maybe a little between big band and bebop, but not between big band and rock and roll. It just wasn't the same at all. The music itself did what I said always happened, because the big band music, and especially bebop, had grown so complex that this went the opposite direction. Now your songs were 2 minutes long. Your record was 2 minutes long. If it had 3 chords, it was pretty complicated. Very simple structures. And that was the first completely dominant sound that people responded to, both in this country, Europe, everywhere. It just became, every place. So that was that rock and roll period there. And as it moved on further, we got to the point where we got into the 60s. The 60s for contemporary music was probably the most creative contemporary field ever. Whether you're talking, about anybody who was big in the 60s, Beatles, obviously, Stones, people like that. And there was so much musicality in Beatles music. And that brought in a whole new crowd of people,
Changed everything.
It changed everything, exactly. It was no longer rock and roll in that sense, And one of the things that proved the Beatles' staying power is both classical music and jazz recorded more Beatles music than anybody did. And jazz wouldn't have touched it unless the progression was sufficient, and classical wouldn't have touched it unless the melody was sufficient, and that is what happened. And then we went through all those periods of the Beach Boys and everything else that happened in the 60s. And so now we have this sense that music's kind of moving forward. And then it got to the point where the world rebelled again and kind of went the other direction. And this time it was somewhat replaced by dance music, our disco era in the 70s and all. And, clearly a different level of music. And then it went on and on and on from the 70s. And we went into the metal bands, and you had that kind of thing going on as well. And each time, each form gained some people and lost some people. And it was interesting to go all the way back and trace all of those things that are happening. Now you're up to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, And once we hit the 90s, I think there was another rebellion where the large amount of people became far less interested in melody, far less interested in harmony. And that's really where rap was born. And the problem that we have with rap, and we don't want to create too much controversy about this, but a reasonable question is rap music? Now there'll be people that say there's no question about it, but it depends. If you go back to when I started out today and say what are the 3 elements of music, and they're melody, harmony, and rhythm. Well, there's no question that early rap had rhythm, but also had no melody. And it also had no harmony. It had no chord progressions. So does that make it music? And does it matter? Does it have to be called music? The answer, no, it does not. But I think it is fair to say that rap then, not in music, but it became a very important element of contemporary society because it is a verbal communications form supported by rhythm. and I don't think there's anything wrong with calling it music. It just depends on how how you define it. And most of us in the music business, I don't think we thought that rap would last very long. I think we thought it was going to be a small trend, but not so. It keeps going. Of course, it has also evolved into hip hop, and many other forms. And there are people that are trying to do music, more musical things with it. But it has an enormous audience. And when you see rappers, whether they be white rappers or black rappers, have the audience they have the sales they have the wealth they have, it's kind of hard to argue that it's not an important trend, Right. I think the other thing that's worth talking about, which is awfully important, was as the singer-songwriter came in. Most people don't realize that in the 30s and 40s and even 50s, there was a team that presented a song. There was the music writer, there was the lyric writer, and there was the singer. And I think young people today would be surprised to know that the singer never wrote and the writer never sang, etc. It was always a team. And that went back, including the big band stuff, and including Broadway music, and you had all of those things. So that's where I alluded earlier to Dylan. That's where Dylan made a big difference, even though, you might question whether he was a singer, you might question whether he was a musician, but he was an influence. And his influence was, of course, for lyric writing, not for melody and not for harmony and all. But most important thing is he was willing to deal with topics that were very important to society and weren't just, boy gets girl, boy loses girl. That in the 50s, that's all it was. You'd be hard-pressed to go find a song in the 50s that didn't just talk about, boy-girl relationships, So that was a big difference. But then we had another cross, and that's what makes this topic so big, because we've always had folk music from early on. Was folk music considered to be a contemporary form? Well, it's an interesting question, because there was a period where folk music was extraordinarily popular and generated a show called Hootenanny. And Hootenanny was 2 hours every Saturday with the best folk artists in the world, whether it was Peter, Paul, and Mary, Kingston Trio, Ian and Sylvia, any of them, right? And they were on every single week for 2 hours. So that was huge. And that's what led to the coffee house, because that's what you could do in a coffee house. You were going to come in with a lot of volume. You're going to come in with your guitar and your voice, and you're going to sing your songs, right? So that had been going on in country music for quite a while. But now folk music was starting to cross with country and starting to cross with contemporary, and that's where we had James Taylor coming in, We eventually also had, Carole King and all. Now, she was a little bit different because she was a piano player and not a guitar player. But most people were not aware of the fact that Carole King was not a singer. She was one of the writers in the famous Brill Building, and she wrote all kinds of hits for all kinds of groups, Will You Love Me Tomorrow, and on and on and on. And she was the one that gave James Taylor You've Got a Friend. So at this point, most people think that James Taylor wrote You've Got a Friend. He didn't, and he never said he did. He was always very grateful to her. He said the only problem he ever had with Carole giving him the song is that he has to sing it every night of his life. But you had all of these, that Harry Chapin coming in and all that. And so that was its own evolution right there, the singer-songwriter. Today, I think the singer-songwriter is, a very, very important element because they get to tell stories. I think the artist that you're currently working with is a singer-songwriter, right. Correct? Yeah. And we've all done a lot of projects with singer-songwriters. And if they have nothing but guitar and voice, it's kind of hard to call them rock and roll. It's kind of hard to call them folk. So I think James Taylor really became a folk rock artist. But today, I think he's beyond that because he has too many elements from jazz, too many elements from blues, from country, etc. So he really, developed this kind of hodgepodge of styles, and of course has had a phenomenal career, because of it. But I think that more or less takes us through all of those periods. And there's not one of those periods that we couldn't have spent an hour dissecting. But if we're going to talk about evolution, we have to talk about, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And I think that I basically hit the highlights of what happened in contemporary music from the cave days up to the current time. So I don't think there's anything more specific that we need to say on that unless, we ultimately get some more specific questions, or unless we are doing something that requires a more technical explanation of music. As an example of that, during one part of my career, I owned and ran an original music production company, and what I had to write was jingles and film scores and things like that. And one of my specialties was the fact that a client could come up to me and could say, we need to use a song that sounds like it was written in 1945, but we don't want to use a song. We want you to write it. So what that obviously had to mean is that I had to know the musical characteristics, the instrumentation of that style. Because if I wrote something that sounded like it came from 1957, then the contract would have fallen apart. And so that kind of thing can be done, but it's not within what we're talking about now. But if we said, okay, let's talk about the musical differences between the big band era and rock and roll. Let's talk about the difference between fusion and heavy metal. And those things can be done too. But that's not a discussion of the evolution. That's more the meat and potatoes of the different styles. For somebody to know that Santana favored a Dorian scale is not helpful in evolution. It might be interesting, but then again, how many people know what that scale means anyway? So I think that's a pretty big wrap up, and I could continue, but I don't think I would do anything but kind of be repetitive.
Yeah, well, it's always when you're discussing something like this, you have to have sort of a consistent level of depth, and I think you did that very well, because it's very easy to go into details on something, but keep it all on the same level.
I think it's interesting for people to kind of be aware of how this evolves from here to here, because let's face it, none of us were there to experience that. Not only were we not in the caveman category, but we also, in most cases, we weren't adults in 1920 either. But to look back and to see the crisscrossing of all of these things, and you could certainly find artists today that borrow from ragtime. They borrow from this, they borrow from that. And because of it, they come up with a new and fresh style. But most of the time, that just becomes characteristic of them. It's not a whole trend. But I think I basically hit most of the trends that would explain the evolution of contemporary music.
Yeah, I thought you did a terrific job. I really appreciate it, Chuck. And, we talked before, we came up with a long list of potential topics, and I think they're all really fascinating. So I hope to have you back soon discussing another aspect of this because, my experience has been that for so many people in our business, they don't really have a sense of the history. They don't really understand where things came from.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And they may not be all that interested, but I think if you're going to be in this business and be successful in this business, you need to know where everything came from.
I agree. And not only is it interesting intellectually, but the sensibilities of each era will influence the direction that you go.
Right.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, it was fun.
Yep. We'll do some more another time soon.
Absolutely. We'll do some other 15-hour topic in 1 hour.
Great. Thanks, Chuck.
Very welcome.
I've been talking with jazz guitarist, composer, and teacher Chuck Anderson. Chuck will be back another time to discuss another aspect of music. Thanks for listening, and please share this podcast with anyone you think would be interested. I can always be reached at dwfearn@dwfearn.com for your comments and suggestions for future episodes. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.